Hello, everyone. This is Marc Sabatella from Outside Shore Music. How is everyone doing? This is the Music Masterclass. So, welcome. This is our series where we look at making music. We talk about composing, arranging, music theory, harmony, counterpoint, improvisation, all of the creative aspects of music making. And sometimes we have a particular subject that we're looking at, like we're going to be talking about counterpoint coming up a lot because we'll be starting the counterpoint course as a cohort. But for this week, what we'll be doing is just looking at some of the music that has been submitted lately by people of different purposes, some personal projects, some in response to some of the previous coursework. So let's just kind of dive into this. I'm going to just say maybe one or two overall comments first before I get underway. So next week you'll be hearing all about the Counterpoint course launch. I'll have emails that go out with the whole thing where I tell you what's going on. It's going to be maybe a little different from other courses because it's really just about the cohort. The course has already been out for a while, and so it's going to be a little different how I actually manage things. But we're going to be kind of just talking about counterpoint over the next several months and reviewing the material in the course, having projects and so forth. So just be expecting to hear a lot more from me starting next week about the Counterpoint course. All right, so I want to get over to my window where I've got things loaded up. And these are some various scores that people have uploaded, and they're kind of, I don't have a particular scheme in mind for how I'm looking at these things. I just want to look and see what each of them has to show me. And so I've looked a little bit at most of these before. Some of them I might actually just be seeing for the first time. So this is, Jimmy had created this arrangement of Cielito Lindo in which he was really just playing with chord inversions, and I just wanted to talk briefly about that because he's really just using basic primary triads here. And so I just want to talk about some of the logistics of what he's doing in this. So here we go with Cielito Lindo. All right, so nice job in selecting the right 1, 4, and 5 chords to hit this thing, and a lot of the things you're doing in inversions are really effective as well. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about that. So first of all, one observation is this is just a really simple block chord type of accompaniment, right? And so this is always a good starting point for then anything else you might want to do. Like if you want to change that to an arpeggiated chord, knowing the voicing that you have is a great starting point. You may recall if you watched the cafe yesterday, I was looking at that Bach or whatever. Yeah, I don't remember. I don't remember what the notes were. Doesn't matter. But I pointed out that there was a place where it looks like it's arpeggiating, but it's really just about connecting chords smoothly. So getting the chords connected smoothly is your first starting point, and then you can worry about the arpeggiation and so forth. So when we talk about smoothly, this, of course, is a big leap here, right? Now, big leaps aren't inherently a problem, and root position chords by default are what we want. And so you're going to get big leaps if you have 2 root position chords in a row, right? That's going to happen anytime you have circle of fifths motion, whether it's forward on the circle of fifths or backwards on the circle of fifths. Anytime you're moving by fifth, you're going to have that same situation occur where the root is leaping, and the rest of the voicing is going to have to leap with it, simply because that is what the hand has to do, right? The hand, unfortunately, it would be lovely, right? If we were arranging this for something other than piano, we could do things like this. Right? We could have a nice open voicing here, and then take the upper voices, move them by step, while the bass moves by leap. That would absolutely be what we would do if we were arranging for an ensemble. But you can't do that physically on the piano. Now you could, if you break the chord up appropriately, but you are actually making it a little physically harder, and you have to think a little bit about how much of that you're willing to do, right? So anyhow, I just wanted to point out that sort of leap is going to happen often. And then this leap here is a similar story, right? We're leaping from root position to root position, and normally, yeah, we want root position chords in cadences, and if I thought my hand could handle it, I might be looking at something like that, so that, but see how much work it is for me? Yeah, I'm not made sure I was sharing my keys. It's a lot of work to stretch and make that, so that's not necessarily viable. And so sometimes we just look at things like simplifying our voicing. So like, the B is already covered in the melody, and so what if we only played the root and fifth in the left hand, and now we only have to play 2 notes. This is still a stretch, but I can do it better than this, because this involves me also getting that index finger into position, right? So that's a possibility also. So we're often looking for practical things like that when writing for piano to make it playable. But yeah, when you have 1, 4, and 5 chords, you're going to have an awful lot of places where the root is moving by fifth, and you have to do these things. Now, in this passage, you're using stepwise motion, or Jimmy's using stepwise motion. I mean, not stepwise, inversions to create some stepwise bass motion. So he's got from the C to the F chord, keeping the C in the bass. Now, from a functional perspective, if I was arranging this for an ensemble, I'm not sure that I would have done that in terms of like, why have a second inversion F chord there? Is there a good theoretical reason for it? Maybe, maybe not, but there's a great practical reason for it. I can do this, right? I can do that. I wouldn't want to do that like lower. There's a point at which it feels too low to do that sort of thing, but this feels like a good range for it. And then going from this second inversion to that second inversion chord is nice stepwise motion. Now, at that point, I might actually not want to do this. First of all, that's another one of those reaches that I can't really get. It's a beautiful voicing. Oh, I love that type of voicing. 3, root, 5. It's a lovely sound, but it is hard to reach, especially if you're just going to do it for 1 chord and then, for 1 beat and then have to move. So from a practical perspective on the piano, that's a little awkward. But also, we're going from 1 inversion here to another inversion here that are not a step away. Now, I am not one to talk about rules, thou shalt not, blah, blah, blah. However, I will put this in your head. I've mentioned things about this before. It bears repeating here. If you have an inversion of a chord, by an inversion I specifically mean the bass note is not the root. If you have an inversion of a chord, and it is not moving by step in the bass, think about whether that's really what you want. So I'm not going to say always have to that you always have to move inversions by step. I'm not saying you always have to, but most of the conventional uses of inversions involve the bass moving either by step or, like here, keeping a common tone. So if that bass is moving by more than a step and it's not the root, think hard about why you're doing it. And there might be a good reason for it. But if there's not a really good reason and there's anything at all awkward about it, yeah, don't do it. So Walter's got a great idea. Now, from a practical perspective, absolutely. I could play that C in this chord right here, I could play that C in my right hand. And that totally solves that from a practical perspective if we think that the melody is just going to be exactly what we see here. If we think that there's any possibility that we're going to play that melody in octaves, or that it's eventually going to have more, moving lines, if it's going to have, flowing eighth note and 16th lines, then it's not as convenient. But you're absolutely right. From a practical perspective, in this case, that would be the solution. Move that C to the right hand. So absolutely, Walter. So then we have another situation here of that same situation. F chord in inversion, leaping to a G chord in inversion. Not saying, no, you can't do that, but I will say, why? What are we buying in doing that? And if you got an answer, then great. And Jimmy, if you're here and you want to give me an answer, go for it. But usually the reasons for inversions have to do with smoothing out that bass line. That is normally the reason why we would have a non-root in the bass, is to do something interesting in the bass. And you do that in many places here. So this is all kind of more of the same there. But oh, yeah, this one right here. This is exactly the right stuff. Right? This going from C in root position to C in first inversion to F in root position. This is classic. This is absolutely classic. 1, 1, 6, 4. It's old as the hills, beautiful, beautiful chord progression. I mean, it's just 1 to 4, it's just circle of fifths, but using that inversion to smooth out that bass line and create that nice resolution, that stepwise resolution into the new root is really nice. And he's got the same thing happening right here. Right? And here it's not 1. It's not starting with 1. It's starting on 4 and then visiting 1 in first inversion, coming back to 4, back to 1 in first inversion, back to 4. Yeah, you can write that kind of stuff all day long and you get big thumbs up. That kind of stuff is always going to work. So, yeah, that's, I guess those are my observations about this piece and what's going on with it. So since he specifically mentioned that he's playing around with the inversions on the 1, 4, 5 chord, I thought I would point out those aspects of it. So yeah, nice bones of an arrangement here, and those would be some things to think about. All right, what I want to do is, there's a couple other sort of random things that I wanted to get to, and one is this piece by Dave. It's not really a piece per se, but it's I'm gonna play some things here, talk about it. Dave, were you here today? I didn't see you check in, but I know you're often here. If you want to say anything about it, go for it. But so this is meant to be 12-tone music. And so for people who aren't familiar with 12-tone music, it was a system, or it still is, I'll say devised by Arnold Schoenberg. I mean, whether or not he based it on other things or not, kind of beside the point. He's the guy that put it on the map, of organizing music not based on conventional harmony. He was like, okay, we've got several hundred years of major scales and 1, 4, and 5 chords. What else is there? Is all there is ways of decorating that and getting fancier with what we do with our 1, 4, and 5 and, other diatonic chords and so forth? Or is there something fundamentally different that we can maybe do with music? And so he decided to explore that option. And his system consists of saying, let's take the 12 notes of the chromatic scale. He wasn't one of the people saying, hey, let's go into microtones and so forth. Still dealing with just the chromatic scale, but let's create music that deliberately avoids anything resembling a major scale or a triad for that matter. And so let's take the notes of that chromatic scale and rearrange them to form different melodies that don't outline triads or scales. And so before I jump into that more, I do want to address Joel's comment there about the harmonic rhythm of the piece. And yes, so this is a thing that we had talked about when we did the harmony course and used that piece as an example. When we come back, that there is this thing going on where even though the chord changes in the middle of the bar, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to write the chord change there. And typically you sort of hedge on that in your arrangement and, still create something on the downbeat, even if you have some voice leading, like maybe that A gets supported by an F in the right hand, but then the rest of the chord comes in on one. There's all sorts of things like that. That you can do, and yeah, this creates a hemiola effect where it kind of feels like it's a 2/4 superimposed on the 3. So that's good observations there. All right, so I'm going to play this. So what this is presumably there's a tone row happening here in which the 12 notes of the chromatic scale are arranged in some order. But I'm not sure exactly what he is doing with that, because I look at this and see, well, I see 7 whole notes here. So I'm not sure exactly. Usually, if you're going to write 12-tone music, you literally have a tone row. There's an actual sequence of the 12 tones that forms the foundation of the piece. So I'm not sure exactly how this relates to that. All right, I played that without preparing you for it because yeah, it's very different than what we just heard, right? Very, very different from ones, fours, and fives, right? None of these are chords. None of these are triads. They're all dissonant, right? So we have to let go of certain norms of what we think of as consonant and dissonant and think more generally in terms of tension and release when dealing with music like this. And that's what then becomes your compositional materials. How are you creating tension? How are you creating release? How are you managing that? How are you developing melodic material? How are you doing all of the other things that go into composition, but not worrying about chords, right? And so one thing that I'll say, so yeah, again, I'm not totally sure. So like horizontally, that doesn't add up to a 12-tone tone row. And the other thing with a tone row is you would normally wouldn't repeat any pitches before you see them again. So the fact that that A got repeated in the violin makes it not seem like one. But I wonder if it's a vertical sonority where he's got a G sharp, an A, got a G, and a C. But then he's got another A. So I'm not sure exactly what the tone row is. If there's a tone row, you should be able to write it out in letters. So and so then he just has the same piece then scored for different instruments. So normally then the onus is on you as a composer once you've come up with your tone row to, since it's not going to have harmonic structure to it that gives it sense, you have to focus that much more on everything else. So you start off with this tone row, and then you're like, all right, now what can I do with it melodically? What can I do with it rhythmically? What can I do with it texturally? What can I do to make it interesting music above and beyond just being a tone row, right? So that is the next step. Your first step is come up with your tone row. Second step is now what am I going to do with that tone row? And that's the big step. Coming up with the tone row is, could almost be random, although it's not, and no more than a fugue subject is random. So, it would be interesting to find out. So he was aiming for 8 bars and ended up with 7. But again, if your point is to be a 12-tone piece, I expect there to be 12 tones. And so I'm not totally sure what's going on. But in any case, that's... is this the one I was looking for? Yes. We're not going to be talking a whole lot about 12-tone music, but since Dave posted that, I thought it was worth further comment. Comes back to the world of tonal harmony. This is Walter's arrangement of the Ash Grove, which was one of our sample pieces in the course. And so here he is also using basic diatonic chords. I am assuming that's what I mostly see here. Let me actually zoom in a little more. There we go. And they're mostly in root position. He's got a little going on as far as, creating some motion, so it's not just the block chords, although it largely is about the block chords. So we're going to listen to this, and then I'll talk a little bit about this one as well. All right, so Walter, you got some really nice, interesting things going on with this. And when we talked about it a little bit in office hours, you had indicated that you were breaking or bending some rules or something like that. And I said, oh, yeah, that's fine, especially given that we're not like in the harmony course anymore. This is like you're tackling this, a little outside the context of the original cohort. So by all means, explore what you want. And so my favorite aspects of it are these little left hand flourishes. Especially, I love this passage right here. So that's just a really interesting little squirrely. A nice little melodic line that the bass has. It's got some chromaticism, and yet it makes harmonic sense as well, right? If we just look at it harmonically and ignore the E, the D sharp, and the B flat as non-chord tones, we have basically the one chord in second inversion, and then we have basically the 5 chord in second inversion, resolving to 1. So it's a quite, I mean, and I talk about inversions, we could say the D is still in our ears, and so that this, when I call this a 5 chord, I could say it's a 5 chord in root position because our ear is still hearing that D. I don't want to get too obsessed about that detail, but essentially what we have, the bones of this is 1-6-4 to 5 to 1. And this is just nice chromatic motion around that to create some interesting counterpoint on it. So this is the sort of thing we're going to be exploring a lot more in the counterpoint course, creating lines that also express the harmonies we want to express. And so, yeah, there's a lot of places where you do interesting things like that, but that was like the one that really jumped out at me as, oh, I love that one. Now, there's some things about this that I'm going to point out as not like problems in themselves, but as, so for this piece, I assigned it in the harmony course for a very specific reason, and that was to work on specific harmonic techniques, whether it was strictly diatonic harmonizations, strictly primary, or whether we're also going to explore secondary triad substitutions, or if we're going to look at secondary dominance, or if we're going to look at borrowed chords, etc. So we're going to use this piece as an opportunity to explore specific techniques. And so what I would say here, I mean, Walter, if you want to speak to this at all, I'm not sure what specific technique you might have been going for here. But if the goal is to use this piece to learn about harmony, then I would definitely recommend using it in that specific way. Say, I'm going to work on this specifically to go with the secondary dominant section of the course, and specifically use it to explore secondary dominance versus whatever else. Because the thing is, there's certain uses of chords here, like this is what we would call double, the D, E sharp, G sharp. It's like a double neighbor tone, because right, we have a D chord and then neighbor tones and coming back. So that's not necessarily harmonically significant, but there's other chords that are in here that do feel like right here you have an entire F sharp triad. And then it becomes, then it becomes the D chord there. So it's totally fine to put these triads in there, but you'd want to know, well, why are you doing it? What is the harmonic function of that chord? Because otherwise you're not learning how to use the techniques that I'm teaching in the course. So certainly if you're going to be using this piece to practice the techniques in the course, I would definitely challenge you to be really specific about which course techniques you're using and how you're using them. Now, a lot of the same comments that I gave before about inversions are going to apply here. If you have inversions that you're using that aren't moving by step, ask yourself why. What is the point of that inversion? Like if here I have this, I guess here we have this D resolving to the D, keeping a common tone, which is fine. Although usually at a cadence, we want a root position chord, or at most a first inversion chord, not a second inversion chord. So that again is something to explore. And could it be called a borrowed note? Colleen's asking, and I guess I'm not sure which one you're asking. If you're talking about this F sharp chord, the thing is that the key of G major doesn't have that chord. The key of G minor doesn't have that chord. So it's not borrowed in the traditional sense. What key does have that chord? Well, B minor does. And so I would look at this and say it looks like I'm tonicizing a B minor chord. And if that progression had gone, because he actually has a B minor chord in the middle of that bar, and then this chord looks like the 5 chord in B minor. So if it had come back to B minor, that totally would have made sense as a little tonicization of the 3 chord, right? So, and then it would also hit the ears a certain way. So I want to talk about the ear at this point a little bit, because Walter, I know you've mentioned that you do most things by ear, and you're trying to fill things in with knowledge now. Okay, measure 14, I'll come back to that in a second. Oh yeah, these notes, yeah, that B flat totally does come from G minor, you're right. And it gives you a little of that sound. But yeah, the D sharp, maybe not so much. So I feel like this whole line is just sort of an interesting chromatic exploration. But in any case, let's come back to the ear thing. The ear is really good at coming up with things we've heard before, right? The ear is going to lead you to stuff you've heard before and say, oh, I like this thing because it sounds familiar. It reminds me of this other thing. What typically happens when doing things by ear, when not also augmented with some theoretical knowledge, is the ear maybe misleads you slightly sometimes. Or I won't say misleads you, but your interpretation can be a little off of what you thought you heard. Like in your mind's eye or your mind's ear, you might have been hearing this, right? Your mind might have actually heard that, but then when you went to actually play it on the piano, you didn't know how to find that, and so you came up with this other thing instead. I'm not exactly what happened here, but I am saying this happens often. So your ear hears something that is familiar, that is, in accordance with traditional practice, but then your attempt to reproduce what you heard in your head, you're off on the details because you just weren't paying sufficiently close attention. And we're not even paying close attention, because you just, by the time you play something on the piano, your original mental image of what you're hearing is gone, because now you're hearing what you played, and you hear what you played and goes, oh, well, I think I like that too. And it's not necessarily where your ear was leading you. And so that kind of thing happens often. So the more of the theory knowledge you have, the better you are at recognizing what it is the ear is trying to tell you and getting it right the first time and being able to do it. And so, again, if the goal is to learn about harmony, to learn about the techniques that have been used for hundreds of years, it absolutely pays to think about those things and ask yourself, well, what is it that my ear was hearing that caused me to want this chord? What is it theoretically that was going on? And ask yourself those questions of your mental image without actually touching the piano, and destroying that mental image, getting as complete an understanding as you can first. So that's some practical advice there. So, yeah, but some really nice things going on in here. You've got, similar ideas of like some of these chords. This is, 1 chord going to 4 chord in root position. Nothing wrong with that. But as voicings go, it would be nicer if the voice leading was smoother somehow. You figure out a way of keeping root position, because I want the root position. Right? I want the root position. I want the root to go G to C, and I want my hand to be able to play the chord comfortably, but I do want to avoid as much as possible just picking up an entire triad and shifting that whole thing up a fifth, because that isn't going to sound as smooth as we want. Plus, this one is a little low, right? We have 2 notes below this C. That's kind of my rule of thumb I talk about sometimes. Don't play 2 different pitches below this C here. You can do it for note's a perfect fifth away or an octave, but don't give me anything else other than roots and fifths lower than about here, unless you're Beethoven and you're writing, right? And you want that big heavy opening chord. So yeah, the idea of having these be root position is great, but here, if it could break up. So all I did was take that G chord, I kept the G in the bass, and then I played the rest of the chord on beat 2. And I didn't bother including the third in my left hand because it was in the right hand. And then I could do the same in the left hand here. Normally, I don't love not putting the third in my left hand. You know, I want my third to be covered, but if it's prominent in the melody, yeah, I could be okay with it. So yeah, that idea of when you have these root position chords moving by fifth, you want to have that, but you want to think about voice leading as well. All right, Joel, since you are here, I am going to pull up one of your pieces, and since we're about to be talking about counterpoint a lot, I am going to use your fugue as an example because it's a cool piece and gives people a chance to hear some of your work here. So I want the short fugue is the one I want. Boom. So this piece of Joel's, I mean, Joel is like a really good, accomplished composer and has posted a lot of music over the years here, and definitely check it out. He's posted several pieces recently, some larger scale pieces, and by all means be checking them out, give comments and so forth. But I want to talk about this short fugue here that is exemplifies some of the things that we'll be talking about in the counterpoint course. So when we say that it's short, you can see it's 43 measures long, and which is, you know, that's not like necessary. I mean, a lot of fugues are on the short side because it's so much involved in putting them together. But the idea with a fugue, and we're going to learn much more about this in the counterpoint course, is that you have a main melody that is called the subject, and then that subject gets repeated in all other voices at different pitch levels. Like it starts off here, right? It starts off there in the key of C major, but then it gets answered by this other phrase that's like a fifth higher. There's been adjustments made to it, all techniques that we're going to learn about more, and then you're going to hear that same line come in again here in that bottom voice there. And then you hear that melody get developed. And so when I talked about, like in the 12-tone thing, how important the idea of development is, fugues are all about developing of that subject. So with that said, I'm just going to play it. Yeah, lovely, Joel. Another great piece, and hope your seventh grade students are applauding you right now. So yeah, I just want to spend a couple minutes just talking through this one a little bit as well, because yeah, I just want to be looking at a few different pieces here. And so when you mentioned in the style of late Beethoven, when you listen to the beginning of it, I think we could be excused for saying, well, it doesn't necessarily sound particularly late Beethoven-ish, right? There's nothing. I mean, the melody itself, the fact that it has that B flat in it, is it in C or is it in F? And other than just a little detail about that, it sounds like the sort of thing, and the treatment of the exposition is very much, in the character of Baroque expositions as well. It's as it gets into development that it really starts to feel more like Beethoven's wheelhouse harmonically, because you're going places that definitely Bach wouldn't normally go. So I just want to talk about a couple things about this for people who are wondering about the mechanics of doing fugues. So I mentioned that this entrance here is adjusted. And what I mean by that is if you look at the original melody, it starts off with a perfect fourth, but the answer comes in starting with a perfect fifth. Well, why is that? It's for a very simple reason. It's simple in principle, but complicated in practice. Is we don't want it to feel like it's changed keys. In other words, just because we're going to bring in that subject up a fifth, we don't want it to feel like we're in the key of G yet. So, if this melody had started by starting that melody with D, which would be the literal transposition of that up a fifth, it would feel like we're in the key of G already. And that's okay, but typically we smooth this out a little bit. We like that answer to come in still feeling like we're in the original key, so we might make an adjustment at the beginning of that second subject statement to make it still feel like it's in the original key, even though eventually there's going to be notes that still suggest the key of G, like that F sharp. Now notice that those B flats here become F naturals here, and so that brings us back to the key of C. Here it feels like we're in the key of F at the beginning. I can play that. Right? For a little bit while we're hearing those Fs, we might be wondering, well, wait a minute, are we in F or are we in C? But, most of the melody I'm playing it faster than written. Did I? Yeah, this definitely feels like the key of C to me. You can kind of hear 1 to 5 to 1 happening in there. So anyhow, that is that. And then, the third voice comes in here and does what the third voice does, basically back into the original key. Now, there's some things here that happen, like by the time we have everyone in and there's more stuff going on. So now we have this fourth voice here that's also back in that key of G, but with that adjustment. Right, so that voice now at the bottom is back in the same key as the second one, and that's also very typical for how this sort of stuff works. Now, the way it goes into minor here. So this is like at the end, after all the voices have come in, we've established every voice has stated its subject. Now this is the development section, if you will. And he goes right into minor. And then, right, and now we're not just in A minor, but we're introducing additional chromaticism that is pulling us in a flatter direction, right? The E flats and the B flats. And then, some more tonicizations pulling us in yet other harmonic directions. This is the point at which, Beethoven has entered the house, as it were. And so, yeah, so when Joel says that this is stretto, what he means is that as opposed to the beginning, the exposition, where each voice states the subject in full. Like this is the subject here is this full 6 bars. Maybe the last couple notes are technically not part of the subject. I haven't looked at it at that level of detail. But then the second voice comes in and it does its full statement of that subject for 6 bars. And yeah, it looks like it differs a little bit in those last couple of notes. And then the third voice comes in and it does its full 6 bar statement. And then the fourth voice comes in, does its full 6 bar statement. In that development section, you do other techniques to develop these things, and one of the most typical ones is what's called stretto, where you have the subject being stated, but then another voice comes in with that subject before the first one finishes. To me, that's like the fun part of a fugue. I would never say you can't write a fugue without stretto. I would just say not worth my bother. I wouldn't bother writing a fugue without stretto because strettos are so much fun. They're so cool. And so we have, and while at that point, then the next voice comes in. I'm going to skip that middle voice for a second. Right, so that's actually not the exact same thing, so I kind of lied about the detail about that. But anyhow, that's what stretto is, when you have one voice enter before the first one has finished. And so there's other things that you would expect to see happen, like inversion of things, where that same passage goes upside down, and I think that's actually what's happening. Yeah, I haven't analyzed this to be able to tell you, and Joel, feel free to do that at your leisure in comments here or back in the actual community thread for it. But the idea that, like, if I take this and flip it upside down, I took that melody and flipped the intervals upside down. I started on the same pitch, which you wouldn't necessarily have to do, but instead of going up a fourth, I'm going down a fourth. Instead of going down a half step, I'm going up a half step. Instead of going up a third, I'm going down a third. And then instead of down a step, I'm coming back up a step, right? That's inversion. And this is another tried and true technique in fugue development that also becomes a huge part of the 12-tone music. So when we looked at that piece of Dave's and he had that tone row or something that was going in the tone row direction, and I said, well, what counts is how you're going to develop that idea. And the development in strict 12-tone music, there's all these rules that get established to follow to kind of take the place of the conventions of tonal harmony. And the idea that you're going to take that tone row and then also express it in an inversion and or retrograde, where you run it backwards, or both, and all specific augmentation where you double the length of all the note values, diminution where you shorten the lengths of all the note values. These are techniques that are tried and true fugue techniques that also then become huge in 12-tone music, because they are what provide the structure that you're not going to get from harmony. Since you're not going to have 5-to-1 cadences and so forth in 12-tone music, what can you hang your hat on? And the answer is things like inversion and so forth, inversion and retrograde and all those sorts of things. So this section here, just check out what's going on harmonically. Inverted retrograde. All right, so there you go. That's why I was looking at it and going, well, I see some inversion, but I'm not quite recognizing it. But the retrograde is the hardest to recognize usually. So this section, we're visiting different keys, right? And so when I talked about it being Beethoven-esque, now it's kind of back, but visiting minor sound, and then that deceptive resolution there, and then this really Beethoven-esque chord here, right? So that is like this, like seriously, romantic type or late classical, however you want to look at it, type of harmonic sounds going on here. when you're writing fugues, you don't you have your choices of like to what extent do you want to think about harmony or to what extent do you want to just think about consonance and dissonance. But the cool thing is they really work out to the same thing because uh, as I observe in the counterpoint course, kind of make a big deal out of in one of the lessons because it is a big deal. If you want to play three notes at the same time and not create any dissonances, triad is your way to go. The only way to play three notes at the same time but not create any dissonance are basically root position major triad, root position minor triad, or first inversion minor triad, or first inversion major triad. Those are the only combinations of three notes you can play that don't contain any dissonances. Second inversion triads have a dissonance in that a fourth above the bass is considered a dissonance, and we go into that in more detail in the counterpoint course about what it really means, because it's clearly not as dissonant as that, right? So different levels of dissonance, but in any case, you end up, so even if you're not thinking about triads, if you're trying to create consonances, you're going to create triads. And then if you do normal things with your voice leading, you're going to create 5-to-1 progressions. You're going to create a lot of harmony that is conventional harmony. If you're thinking about the harmony, you can push that and do interesting things about how you use your secondary dominants, where you bring in borrowed chords, where you bring in augmented sixth chords, and so forth. If you're choosing not to think about that, you're going to also still come up with triads, but they might move in less conventional ways, which is actually more pre-Baroque thinking. A lot of Renaissance counterpoint, it's just thinking about consonance and dissonance, not so much about triads. They end up with triads, but then they don't necessarily move in conventional ways, but they also don't typically visit as many different keys as that development section just did. This section here, Joel, if you want to say, okay, so that was a deceptive resolution, right? We're in basically G minor here. I mean C minor. Right, C minor. And then resolving deceptively to that sixth chord, flat six as I would call it. Now this chord here that I am calling Beethoven-esque, what it really is an augmented sixth chord, right? It's an A flat. It's this chord going there, except by putting the seventh of, by putting that note, the augmented sixth, A flat to F sharp, by putting that augmented sixth in the bass, we get a very effective sound that moves very nicely to that one chord in second inversion, that 1-6-4 chord. And it's a really nice sound, but it's pushing how augmented sixth chords are typically used in ways that are reminiscent of how Beethoven would typically push those kinds of sounds. So even though I can't point to a specific example and say, oh yeah, Beethoven used exactly that chord in exactly that inversion in exactly this piece, I can say that stylistically it reminds me the heck out of Beethoven to hear that chord there. And have it, have that fermata on it and all. That's another like dramatic Beethoven-esque device. So, great stuff there, Joel. And there you go. So it's great example of a fugue that pushes some harmonic things in a way that Beethoven does to show that fugues don't have to sound like Bach, even though the beginning, arguably still sounds like Bach. Then we get to that development section and you see that it's possible to take it in other directions, and I show that as well within the course, showing how it's possible to take counterpoint and apply it to jazz and other sorts of sounds as well. So great job, Joel. And we're going to be at these counterpoint techniques a whole lot more going forward. All right, I'm going to pop into one or two other pieces. Yeah, probably time for one more. There's several things that were posted that are basically arrangements of other pieces or analyses of other pieces. This is essentially Kevin. Oh, Kevin was here, and then was Kevin the one who said gotta go? But he posted this. This was a kind of an analysis, basically, of this particular Puccini Requiem here. As far as I understand it, this isn't a new arrangement. This is just his analysis there and his discussion of it. So I'll definitely, encourage people to comment on that. But what I am going to do is just take a brief look at Rod's Prelude to an Afternoon of Faun. So this is obviously also, not an original piece. This is Debussy, and it's not rearranged per se. It's been entered into MuseScore and then with some harmonic analysis to it. And here again, it's mostly about just talking about what's going on in it harmonically. And so I'm going to encourage people to take a look at this. But I do want to play a little bit of this piece here, simply because when I talked about Baroque music and then Beethoven and then also 12-tone music, we have to look at Debussy as sort of a, a bridge of some kind here. Because when we look at this piece here, it is not tonal. It doesn't have 1-4-5 types of things in conventional sense, and yet it's not atonal either. So even if you didn't know the name of it, you probably recognize this line, right? So I have to stop it right there and ask, if you didn't already see a key signature on this, would you have anything to hang your hat on to tell you what key it was in just based on the sound? Maybe no, not so much, right? Because it's so chromatic in that melody. Did I play that right? Yeah. So it's very highly chromatic. It keeps coming back to that C sharp, so you kind of think, well, maybe that C sharp is the tonic, but man, landing on a G is like, oh, is this really a tonic going to a flat 5 scale degree, or is it like getting ready to resolve that whole thing to a D major chord? You really don't know, right? So Debussy, and that's just that part. And then as we go on further, you're going to hear chords that really just don't make sense. I don't know how to put it in any other way. They don't make sense in the way that we are taught to think about harmony. Back to that minor chord here. Back to this major chord here. And then there's this sound here, which he's identifying as a D major 7, but it is the darkest D major 7 I've ever heard in my life. So I would wonder what's going on to make that be the case, because I think there's more going on than that, but I haven't done the analysis to let you know, to tell you. But I mean, D major 7 has a chance to be a nice, simple sounding thing, but notice it's that same melody, but because the D is explicitly stated in the bass, we are not hearing C sharp. It is more like that sound I talked about, but not really. Because then it goes to this minor chord sounding thing. Let's listen to that. Now he's calling this minor, but these A flats here are telling me a different story. That's transpose. Sorry about that. So yeah, again, I haven't done the analysis, but just from listening to this and looking at his analysis here, there is no key in the world that has all those chords in it. There is no key in the world in which a C sharp minor 6, a B flat 7, a D major 7, and a D minor 6 make a lick of sense functionally, right? They're chords that, getting back to what we talked about with Walter, your ear might lead you to some things, and it might lead you to some sound that's familiar to you, but if you're not knowing what you're doing, you might miss and play something else. So I said that knowing full well that that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes your ear will lead you to totally unique sounds. And that's good to know also, to be able to rule out when you hear the sound in your head and go, you know what, that sound I'm hearing is not 5 to 1. It's not augmented sixth chord resolving to 164. It's not any of the things that I know how to do. It's not 5 of 3 going to 3. It's not 5 resolving deceptively to flat 6. It's none of the things that I can put names on. You hear the sound in your head, and then you're like, oh, I got to reproduce that sound somehow. And then it becomes just about the individual voice leading of what's happening and the color of the vertical sonority, the sound that gets the sound of the notes that we hear together. And so Debussy was the person who maybe exemplified that type of thinking more than anyone else. It's not a competition, but if you're looking for someone to be the champion of this type of thinking, that I'm going to be thinking about chords, this isn't atonal in the sense of what Schoenberg was doing. It's not like deliberately going out of his way to avoid triads. There are triads in here. They're just not moving in conventional ways. This type of music was really, it started to dominate the musical landscape late 19th century, early 20th century. And Schoenberg was saying, okay, that's all well and good, but let's try something different. Let's try going another direction. And so it's almost like thinking of two different directions you can go to expand beyond the confines of conventional harmony. You can either go Debussy's direction of, I'm still going to deal with triads because I still want to honor the conventional sense of consonance and dissonance. I just want to see what else I can do with that information. Or you can say, you know what, we're just not even going to worry about consonant and dissonance. We're going to just focus on the compositional process and what can be created that way and textures and all these things. So Debussy is kind of the poster child, again, for that sort of middle ground as it exists. So I'm just going to play a little more of this piece. So you can just hear there are chords, there are triads, there are sounds that are familiar sounds, but used in unfamiliar ways. Yeah, Charles Ives is another one. Charles Ives maybe pushes things more atonally, at least at times. But yeah, they're of an era. And I'm going to stop there because, like, there's a certain brightening of the sound that happens, and there's also, like, there's no chord symbols written in here, but I feel like there was more of a 5 to 1 sense of what's happening here. This sound, I would, because all these things are transposed, I can't easily sort out exactly everything that's happening here. But this is, I'm pretty sure, it's something that I could put names on and would make a little bit of sense harmonically. And then the next thing that we hear, that's like a tritone substitution sound, going into that sound. That was 1 to minor 4 to 1 if I've ever heard it before, right? I can't read that many sharps and that many transpositions, I mean, at the same time. But I heard this. I heard something very much like that. Let's see if I'm wrong. Yeah, not quite. So it wasn't exactly a minor 4 chord, but it was something else that involved some of that borrowed harmony. Again, I'd have to sort it out. My ear told me it's coming in that direction, but here's another good example of that ear fooling me. What if I heard that, I guess I need to start a measure earlier than that. I'll start here. It wasn't that, right? It was a 5. It was more of a 5 sound. So my ear misled me a little bit. I heard something that felt like this borrowed minor 4 sound, but then when you dig a little deeper, you realize that's not what it was. Well, I would have to dig deeper still to look at the score and sort out the transpositions to know for sure what's happening. But this is a good example of how the ear can fool you. You hear something that you think is one thing, you play it, and then you play it and go, ooh, that wasn't it. And now your memory of what you heard originally is a little gone, and you might not ever get it back. And so composing in this sort of style where you're trying to create these interesting sounds that don't necessarily correspond to traditional types of chord motions, it's an interesting challenge all of its own. And it's actually a place where I spent a lot of my musical time living, writing music in that type of genre harmonically. And so at some point I'll put together some lessons and so forth on that. Anyhow, we talked about a lot of different music, a lot of different things. Hope you enjoyed the process, but got to run now. So thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for the music. We will, again, be digging deep into counterpoint now over the coming months. So next week, I will announce the details about the course, and then the course itself will launch the following Monday, March 4th. That's how things are going. So, Keep putting in music. We'll talk about other music, but next week at Music Masterclass, I'll probably set the stage for the counterpoint course and give people who are on the fence about whether you want to participate or not a little more taste about what the course will actually be like, give you a little tour of things. So that's what you can expect in the Masterclass next week. So I hope everyone has a great week. And yes, I do have a birthday coming up soon, so thanks for the birthday wishes, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.